Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to go over the answer key for the Unit 5 practice summative. So the first standard, which is all about changing ecosystems, you're going to be asked to identify if the organism in question is a keystone species. And then you're also going to be asked to tell from the data if a trophic cascade happened and what type of succession would happen in this example. So from your CER and from your responses, we should be able to tell that you know what a keystone species is, a trophic cascade, and the two types of succession. So here's the example CER that was written. So for the claim is just simply the sea otters are a keystone species. For the evidence, notice that the first piece of evidence is qualitative, so the sea otters are at the top of their food chain. And then later on, I explain keystone species tend to be top predators or apex predators of the food chain. In this example, keystone species are the apex predator before the orcas were introduced. But then obviously the orcas were the apex predator in this example. The next two pieces of evidence are both qualitative. So quantitative, not qualitative. Evidence 2, when the sea otters are hunted by orcas, the grazing on the kelp increases from 50% loss per 24 hours. So I pulled that information from this graph right here. And then when the sea otters are hunted by orcas, the total kelp density declined from about 10 plants per 0.25 square meters to about 1 plant per 0.25 square meters. And then notice how I used specific quantitative data from the graph. You guys really need to start practice doing that. So I just found the relevant information from these graphs and I cited exactly what they were in my evidence. Then in the reasoning, this is where I'm connecting why this quantitative evidence backs up my claim. So reasoning 2, since the keystone species tend to keep the level below them in check, it can be seen from the data that when the otters were removed, the population of sea urchins exploded because they didn't have a predator. Because of this, the amount of grazing on the kelp by the urchins increased by 50%. So there I'm connecting my evidence to my claim. And then reasoning 3, because of the sea urchin population grew uncontrollably after the sea otters were removed and grazing intensified, the density of the kelp decreased dramatically. This is further evidence of sea otters being a keystone species because it shows how the removal caused the ecosystem to crash. Several other species depend on the kelp as a food source. So I'm explaining why this piece of evidence backs up my claim. And this is going to be set up exactly how it is on the actual summative. You're also going to be asked to explain how removing a keystone species causes a trophic cascade. So this example response, when you remove an important species like a keystone species, this causes changes in all parts of the food web. In this example, it can be seen that removing the sea otters not only had an effect on the sea urchins, but also on kelp plants and all the species below the kelp plants that depend on the kelp for food and protection. Effects of removing the keystone species can be seen on several levels below the sea otters. So it's not just that removing the sea otters affected the sea urchins, it also affected the kelp. So it affects more than one level below them. Then the last question, what type of succession would occur if sea otters were removed? And then how do you know? So I said this would be secondary succession because the topsoil is not removed and there are still living organisms in that ecosystem after the sea otter is removed. So remember primary versus secondary. This would be an example of secondary because there is still living things in the ecosystem. All right, so that's all you need to do for the first summative, or excuse me, for the first standard. The second standard about carrying capacity. So this is what we practiced earlier this week. Should have been today. You will be given a graph just to save time. So usually we have you guys make these graphs, but because of time constraints, we're just going to give you the graph and you interpret the graph. You're going to be asked the same questions that you were on the practice activity we did with the Isle Royale example in class. So we're going to ask you about the carrying capacity. So remember, it's not the peak. Carrying capacity is the amount of species that an ecosystem is able to sustain for the long term. So notice that both of these species tend to grow exponentially at first, But then after they dip, after they drop down and they level out, that is the carrying capacity. So it's when the species start to level out, that is the carrying capacity. So I said for the deer, it's about 2,000, and for the wolves, it's about 19. Because notice that there are two different y-axes here. So this is the deer population. The deer in this example are the green dots. So it levels out around here, around 2,000. And then the wolves, it levels out here around, I said 19, you could say 18, 19 would be fine for that answer. Then it says reread the background information, provide one density independent and two density dependent factors. So remember, density independent factors tend to be abiotic things like storms, any sort of natural disaster. Density dependent limiting factors tend to be things that are biotic. So anything that is dependent on the density of the population. So from the scenario I pulled out, storms would be the independent limiting factor, and dependent could be predators or the amount of food, available food. And the last question we're going to ask you is to classify the type of growth as exponential or logistic. So in this question, I'm asking you what type of growth was exhibited from 1971 to 1973 by the deer. So here's 1971 to 1973. Here's the deer. So notice in this short time span, the deer did grow exponentially. Now it did eventually level out over the next couple of years. So this would be logistic growth. But from 71 to 73, this was exponential growth. I said a reason why this could have happened is that the deer at the time had no natural predators and excess food. So this is before they ran out of food and space. And these are the same questions we will ask you on the summative. It will just be a different example and a different graph. Then the last standard is about group behavior. So we're going to give you a brief synopsis of a study done on some sort of animal, just like we practiced in groups. You're going to be given a graph. It could be a line graph, could be a bar graph. But just make sure you read about the graph just in case you get confused about what the x-axis or the y-axis is showing you. And then we're going to ask you just to make a claim about this behavior, why, or if it makes them more reproductively successful. I'm going to tell you it always will. We're never going to give you an example where it doesn't. And then you just have to pull information from the graph, again, using specific quantitative data. So notice how in this example, let me highlight my data real quick. I said, the evidence that backs up the claim, when wolves are hunt by themselves, they have a success rate of attacking of only 0.2 and a success rate of capturing of 0. So I'll show you where I pulled that from. So the top graph here is showing the amount of attacking and then the amount of hunting, or excuse me, the amount of capturing. So when they're by themselves, so when the group size is 1, notice on the attacking, it's about a success rate of 0.2 or 20%, and then percent of capturing, it's 0. So they had a 0% success rate when they were by themselves. Then notice as the number of individuals in the pack increases, as the size of the group increases, so does the rate of attacking and the percent of organisms that they can capture. So then I said when they hunt in packs of 4 or more, their success rate can be from anywhere from 0.5 to 0.8 for capturing and as high as 0.3 for capturing. So I'm using specific quantitative data from the graph to back up my claim. Again, we really need to practice doing that. So this is something, if you don't use specific quantitative data on this summative, you could be bumped down to a 3. So please, please, please make sure I see numbers in your evidence. And then the last question, just classify this type of group behavior with reasoning. And so I said this is cooperative hunting, or the cooperative behavior, which is the example slide that I did on the summative. In our next class period, it will be one of the behaviors that one of you guys did. So make sure you have that Jamboard pulled up if you need it up to remember what those other group behaviors were. And then I explained wolves are working together in packs to take down their prey. They coordinate their movements in their packs. So I'm just using the definition of cooperative behavior in my explanation for my reasoning. Okay, and that is it. So quick review, it's going to be these 3 standards. So make sure you understand keystone species and how removing the keystone species causes a trophic cascade. Be able to classify that as not positive, primary or secondary. Be able to look at a graph of 2 populations changing over time and be able to tell me what the carrying capacity is for one or both of the species. Be able to classify the factors as dependent or independent, and then tell me what type of growth occurred during some point of the study. And for the last one, be able to pull quantitative evidence from the data that backs up the claim that this behavior makes the species more successful. And then be able to classify this type of behavior based on the examples we did in class.